Maria Santos had always been different from the other girls in her small village of San Miguel. While they spent their afternoons learning to cook and sew, Maria could be found behind the old church, practicing the martial arts moves her grandfather had secretly taught her before he passed away. Her grandfather, Don Carlos, had been a legendary fighter in his youth, traveling across the Philippines learning different fighting styles from various masters. Maria's family ran a small restaurant near the military base, and every day she watched the soldiers march past their window. The base commander, General Rodriguez, was known throughout the region as a man who demanded absolute respect and obedience. He was tall, imposing, and had a reputation for being particularly harsh toward anyone who dared to challenge his authority, especially women who he believed should know their place in society. At 19 years old, Maria was not only beautiful but also incredibly intelligent and strong-willed. She had completed her education at the top of her class and helped her parents manage their restaurant, while secretly continuing her martial arts training. Her grandfather had always told her that true strength came not from showing off, but from having the confidence to stand up for what was right when the moment demanded it. The trouble began on a sweltering Tuesday morning when Maria was delivering food to the military base as part of her family's catering contract. She had been making these deliveries for 2 years without incident, but on this particular day, General Rodriguez was conducting an inspection of the base. As Maria walked through the courtyard carrying trays of food, she accidentally bumped into a young recruit who was clearly nervous about the inspection. The recruit, barely 18 years old and obviously new to the military, had been carrying important documents when Maria brushed against him. The papers scattered in the wind, and the boy began frantically trying to collect them. Without hesitation, Maria set down her trays and began helping him gather the scattered documents. She moved quickly and efficiently, her natural athleticism evident in the graceful way she moved. General Rodriguez witnessed this scene from across the courtyard, and his face darkened with anger. In his mind, Maria had disrupted military protocol by interfering with military business. Moreover, he was irritated that a civilian woman had dared to involve herself in military affairs without permission. He had always been particularly sensitive about maintaining strict hierarchies and showing that he was in complete control of his domain. As Maria handed the last of the documents to the grateful recruit, General Rodriguez strode across the courtyard with purposeful steps. The soldiers around the area immediately stood at attention, sensing their commander's displeasure. Maria, however, continued with her work, unaware of the storm that was brewing behind her. "You there, girl," General Rodriguez called out in a voice that carried across the entire courtyard. Maria turned around, surprised by the harsh tone. She had always been polite and professional during her visits to the base, and couldn't understand why the general seemed angry with her. "Yes, sir," Maria replied respectfully, though she noticed the way the general's eyes seemed to look down on her with disdain. "What gives you the right to interfere with military operations?" General Rodriguez demanded, his voice growing louder. "This is a restricted area, and you are here only to deliver food, nothing more." Maria felt her cheeks flush with embarrassment as all the soldiers in the courtyard turned to watch the confrontation. She had only been trying to help, and the general's tone made her feel as though she had committed some terrible crime. However, her grandfather's lessons about standing up for herself began to surface in her mind. "I apologize, General Rodriguez," Maria said carefully, "but the young soldier needed help, and I thought it was the right thing to do. I meant no disrespect." The general's face turned red with anger. He was not accustomed to being questioned or having his authority challenged, even indirectly. In his mind, Maria's calm response was a sign of disrespect, and he decided that she needed to be taught a lesson about knowing her place. "The right thing?" General Rodriguez repeated mockingly. "A simple village girl thinks she knows what's right in a military base? You clearly need to learn some humility." Maria felt her temper beginning to rise, but she remembered her grandfather's teachings about controlling her emotions. Don Carlos had always told her that anger was a fighter's greatest enemy, and that true power came from remaining calm under pressure. She took a deep breath and maintained her respectful posture, even as she felt the unfairness of the situation burning inside her chest. The courtyard had become completely silent except for the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. Even the birds seemed to have stopped singing as tension filled the air. The young recruit whom Maria had helped stood frozen with fear, clutching his documents and clearly wishing he could disappear. The other soldiers watched nervously, knowing their general's reputation for explosive anger. General Rodriguez began to circle around Maria like a predator stalking its prey. He had decided that this young woman needed to be humiliated in front of his men as an example of what happened to civilians who dared to overstep their boundaries. His military boots clicked against the concrete with each deliberate step, creating an ominous rhythm that seemed to echo through the courtyard. "Perhaps," the general said with a cruel smile, "you need a lesson in how to move properly in a military environment. You clearly don't understand how to conduct yourself with appropriate respect." Maria remained standing straight, her dark eyes meeting the general's gaze without flinching. Inside, she could feel the fighting spirit that her grandfather had cultivated beginning to awaken. Don Carlos had always told her that there would come moments in life when she would need to draw upon everything he had taught her, moments when backing down would mean betraying her own dignity and self-respect. The general suddenly stepped directly in front of Maria, using his height and position to try to intimidate her. "From now on," he declared loudly enough for everyone to hear, "you will show proper deference when you enter this base. You will bow when you see me, and you will speak only when spoken to." Maria felt something deep inside her rebel against these unreasonable demands. She had always been respectful to everyone at the base, and she knew that the general was trying to humiliate her simply because he could. Her grandfather's voice seemed to whisper in her ear, reminding her that sometimes the most important battles were the ones that chose you, rather than the ones you chose. "I understand that you command this base, General Rodriguez," Maria said quietly but firmly, "and I have always shown appropriate respect. However, I will not bow to unreasonable demands or allow myself to be treated unfairly." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and everyone in the courtyard seemed to hold their breath. General Rodriguez's face turned a deeper shade of red, and Maria could see that she had pushed him beyond his breaking point. She braced herself for what she knew was coming next, drawing upon years of training and the strength her grandfather had instilled in her. The stage was set for a confrontation that would change everything. General Rodriguez's eyes flashed with fury at Maria's defiant response. In his 30 years of military service, no civilian had ever dared to challenge him so directly, let alone a young woman from a village restaurant. His pride had been wounded in front of his subordinates, and he knew he had to reassert his authority immediately, or risk losing face among his troops. "Insolent girl," the general shouted, his voice echoing off the concrete walls of the courtyard. "You dare to lecture me about fairness? I'll show you what happens to those who forget their place." Without warning, General Rodriguez stepped backward, and then suddenly lunged forward with his right foot, attempting to sweep Maria's legs out from under her. His intention was clear. He wanted to send her tumbling to the ground in front of all the watching soldiers, humiliating her and demonstrating his power over her. The attack was swift and unexpected, the kind of move designed to catch someone completely off guard. However, Maria was not an ordinary village girl. Years of training with her grandfather had honed her reflexes to a razor-sharp edge. The moment she saw the general's weight shift and his foot begin to move, her body responded automatically. Don Carlos had drilled her countless times on reading an opponent's intentions through their body language, and she recognized the attack before the general had even completed his movement. As the general's foot swept toward her legs, Maria smoothly lifted her right foot and stepped back with perfect balance. The general's boot whistled through empty air where her legs had been just a fraction of a second earlier. Her movement was so fluid and natural that it looked almost effortless, like a dancer gracefully avoiding an obstacle. General Rodriguez stumbled slightly, caught off balance by the fact that his attack had met no resistance. He had expected to feel the satisfaction of connecting with Maria's legs and sending her sprawling, but instead found himself sweeping at nothing. The momentum of his failed attack carried him forward, and he had to take an additional step to regain his footing. The soldiers watching from around the courtyard were stunned. They had expected to see the young woman fall victim to their commander's aggressive move, but instead they witnessed something entirely different. Maria stood calmly in her new position, completely composed and unruffled, as if avoiding the general's attack had been as natural as breathing. "You missed," Maria said quietly, her voice carrying clearly across the silent courtyard. There was no mockery in her tone, just a simple statement of fact. But the words hit General Rodriguez like a physical blow. The general's face turned an even deeper shade of red as rage consumed him. Not only had this village girl avoided his attack, but she had done so with such ease that it made him look clumsy and ineffective. Worse still, she had the audacity to point out his failure in front of his own men. His military reputation, built on fear and intimidation, was being challenged by someone he considered far beneath his status. Lucky accident, General Rodriguez snarled through gritted teeth. Let's see how your luck holds up. This time, the general approached more deliberately. He had underestimated Maria's awareness, but he wasn't about to make the same mistake twice. General Rodriguez had received combat training during his military career, and while most of it had been years ago, he still remembered the basics. He moved in a more calculated manner, trying to corner Maria against a nearby wall where she would have less room to maneuver. Maria watched his approach with the calm focus her grandfather had taught her. Don Carlos had always emphasized the importance of remaining centered during conflict, explaining that panic and emotion were a fighter's greatest enemies. She could feel her heartbeat steady and strong, and her breathing remained controlled despite the tense situation. Every muscle in her body was ready to respond, but she appeared outwardly relaxed. As the general closed the distance between them, Maria noticed something important about his movements. Despite his military bearing and intimidating presence, General Rodriguez was not actually a skilled fighter. His attacks were telegraphed and clumsy, relying more on surprise and his position of authority than on actual technique. Maria realized that while he might be accustomed to intimidating others through his rank and aggressive behavior, he was not prepared for someone who could actually defend themselves. General Rodriguez suddenly feinted to his left and then attempted to grab Maria's right arm, intending to spin her around and force her to the ground. It was a move designed to physically dominate and humiliate, rather than seriously harm, but it was still an assault on someone who had done nothing to deserve such treatment. Maria saw the grab coming and responded with a technique her grandfather had taught her called flowing water. Instead of resisting the general's attempt to grasp her arm, she moved with his motion, allowing him to briefly make contact while simultaneously shifting her weight and position. As his hand closed around her wrist, Maria rotated her arm in a small circle that broke his grip immediately and left him grasping at air once again. The fluid grace with which Maria escaped the general's grip was even more impressive than her first evasion. She seemed to move like water flowing around a stone, never fighting directly against his force but simply redirecting it and slipping away. The watching soldiers began to murmur among themselves, amazed at what they were witnessing. General Rodriguez was now breathing heavily, not from physical exertion but from sheer fury. His face had taken on an almost purple hue, and his hands were clenched into tight fists. He had been made to look foolish twice in front of his own troops by a young woman who should have been cowering before his authority. His ego could not tolerate this continued humiliation. "Stand still and take your punishment," General Rodriguez roared, completely losing his composure. "That's an order." Maria remained calm, but her eyes showed a steely determination that had not been there before. "I'm not one of your soldiers, General Rodriguez," she replied in a voice that was quiet but carried clearly across the courtyard. "And I've done nothing wrong that deserves punishment." The truth of her words was evident to everyone watching. Maria had come to the base to deliver food as she had done hundreds of times before. She had helped a young recruit who was in trouble, showing kindness and consideration. She had been respectful in her responses to the general's increasingly unreasonable demands. The only thing she had done wrong was refuse to be bullied and humiliated. Several of the younger soldiers were beginning to look uncomfortable with the situation. They could see that their commander was the aggressor in this confrontation, and some of them were starting to feel sympathy for the young woman who was handling herself with such dignity under pressure. However, none of them dared to intervene or speak up against their commanding officer. General Rodriguez was beyond reason now. His military training and years of command experience had been abandoned in favor of raw anger and wounded pride. He decided to end this embarrassing situation once and for all with a move that would definitely put Maria on the ground where she belonged. The general took several steps backward to give himself room, then charged forward like a bull. His plan was to tackle Maria with his full body weight and superior size, pinning her to the ground and finally asserting his dominance over her. It was a crude and desperate tactic, but in his rage-clouded mind, it seemed like the only way to salvage his reputation. Maria watched him approach with the focused intensity of a martial artist who had trained for exactly this type of situation. Her grandfather had taught her that sometimes the most dangerous opponents were those who abandoned all technique in favor of brute force, because their attacks became unpredictable. However, he had also taught her that such opponents often left themselves vulnerable through their very aggression. As General Rodriguez thundered toward her, Maria made a split-second decision that would change both of their lives forever. Instead of simply evading this attack as she had the previous ones, she decided it was time to end this confrontation decisively. The general had crossed a line by physically attacking her repeatedly, and her grandfather's teachings had always emphasized that sometimes the only way to stop a bully was to show them the consequences of their actions. When General Rodriguez was just 3 feet away from her, Maria stepped slightly to her right and executed a perfect hip throw that her grandfather had made her practice thousands of times. She used the general's own momentum and weight against him, redirecting his charging energy while adding her own precise technique. The movement was so smooth and technically perfect that it looked almost effortless. General Rodriguez found himself suddenly airborne, his feet leaving the ground as his world turned upside down. The throw happened so quickly that he barely had time to realize what was occurring before he crashed onto the concrete courtyard with tremendous force. The sound of his body hitting the ground echoed loudly in the stunned silence that followed. The entire courtyard erupted in shocked gasps and whispers. No one could believe what they had just witnessed. The mighty General Rodriguez, the man who had terrorized subordinates and civilians alike with his authoritarian behavior, lay sprawled unconscious on the concrete, defeated by a 19-year-old girl who delivered food to the base. The courtyard fell into absolute silence as General Rodriguez lay motionless on the concrete. Maria stood over him, breathing steadily, her posture straight and dignified despite what had just occurred. She felt no satisfaction in having hurt someone, but she also felt no regret for defending herself against an unprovoked attack. Her grandfather had always taught her that true martial artists take no pleasure in violence, but they never apologize for protecting themselves or others from harm. The soldiers around the courtyard stood frozen in shock, their minds struggling to process what they had just witnessed. Some of them had served under General Rodriguez for years and had never seen him anything other than completely dominant and in control. Now their commanding officer lay unconscious at the feet of a young civilian woman, and none of them knew how to react to such an unprecedented situation. Lieutenant Colonel Morales, the second in command, was the first to break from his paralysis. He rushed toward the general's prone form, kneeling beside him to check for signs of consciousness. General Rodriguez was breathing normally and showed no signs of serious injury, but he remained completely unconscious from the impact of hitting the concrete. "Get the medic!" Lieutenant Colonel Morales shouted to the nearest soldier, who immediately ran toward the medical facility. The officer then looked up at Maria with a mixture of amazement and uncertainty. He had witnessed the entire confrontation and knew that the general had been the aggressor, but the fact remained that a civilian had just knocked out the base commander. Maria remained calm and collected, her training having taught her to stay composed even in the aftermath of physical confrontation. She looked down at Lieutenant Colonel Morales with genuine concern in her eyes. "Is he seriously hurt?" she asked quietly. "I didn't want to harm him, but he wouldn't stop attacking me." The sincerity in Maria's voice and the obvious regret she felt about the situation helped Lieutenant Colonel Morales understand that she was not a threat to the base or its personnel. He had watched the entire incident unfold and knew that Maria had tried repeatedly to de-escalate the situation before finally defending herself. "He appears to be unconscious, but not seriously injured," Lieutenant Colonel Morales replied professionally. "However, I'm going to need you to come with me to give a statement about what happened here." Before Maria could respond, the base medic arrived with 2 assistants carrying a stretcher. They quickly examined General Rodriguez and confirmed that while he was unconscious, his vital signs were stable, and he showed no signs of serious head trauma. The medic explained that the general had likely been knocked unconscious by the shock of the fall rather than any specific injury, and that he would probably regain consciousness within the next few minutes. As the medical team prepared to transport General Rodriguez to the base hospital for observation, word of the incident began to spread throughout the military installation. Soldiers who had not witnessed the confrontation firsthand gathered in small groups, whispering about the unbelievable news that their feared commander had been defeated by a young woman from the local village. Lieutenant Colonel Morales escorted Maria to his office, where he asked her to provide a detailed account of everything that had occurred. Maria spoke honestly and thoroughly, describing each step of the confrontation and explaining her attempts to avoid violence before finally defending herself. Her calm, straightforward manner and obvious honesty impressed the lieutenant colonel, who realized that General Rodriguez had clearly been the aggressor in the situation. While Maria was giving her statement, General Rodriguez regained consciousness in the base hospital. His first sensation was a pounding headache, followed immediately by the humiliating memory of what had happened in the courtyard. The rage that had consumed him earlier was now replaced by a deep sense of shame and embarrassment. He realized that his behavior had been completely inappropriate and that he had brought this humiliation upon himself. News of the incident quickly spread beyond the military base to the surrounding communities. Maria's family was initially terrified when they learned what had happened, fearing that their daughter might face serious consequences for her actions against such a powerful military figure. However, as the full story became known, public opinion began to strongly favor Maria. The local villagers had long been aware of General Rodriguez's arrogant and bullying behavior toward civilians. Many families had experienced his rudeness and disrespect during his interactions with the local community. Maria's courageous stand against his intimidation became a symbol of dignity and self-respect that resonated deeply with people who had felt powerless against military authority. Within hours, a crowd of supporters had gathered outside the military base, demanding Maria's immediate release and calling for an investigation into General Rodriguez's conduct. The crowd included not only villagers from San Miguel but also people from surrounding communities who had heard about the incident and wanted to show their support for the young woman who had stood up to a bully. Lieutenant Colonel Morales found himself in an extremely difficult position. Military protocol dictated that attacking a commanding officer was a serious offense, but the circumstances of this case were highly unusual. Maria was a civilian who had clearly been defending herself against an unprovoked assault. Moreover, General Rodriguez's behavior had been witnessed by dozens of soldiers, making it impossible to deny or cover up what had really happened. As Maria waited in the lieutenant colonel's office, she reflected on the events that had led to this moment. She thought about her grandfather Don Carlos and the lessons he had taught her about courage, dignity, and standing up for what was right. She realized that everything he had prepared her for had led to this confrontation, and she felt proud that she had honored his memory by refusing to be intimidated or humiliated. The situation became even more complicated when General Rodriguez, despite his injuries and embarrassment, attempted to file charges against Maria for assault. However, his own officers were reluctant to support his version of events. Having witnessed his unprovoked attacks on an innocent civilian, several soldiers came forward to provide testimony supporting Maria's account of the incident. Regional military authorities were called in to investigate the situation, and their inquiry quickly revealed a pattern of inappropriate behavior by General Rodriguez. Multiple reports emerged of his bullying and intimidation of both military personnel and civilians, painting a picture of an officer who had abused his authority for years without consequence. Maria's story captured the attention of local journalists, who interviewed villagers and soldiers about the incident. The narrative that emerged was one of a brave young woman who had refused to be bullied by someone who abused his position of power. Her composure and dignity throughout the ordeal only added to the public's admiration for her courage. 3 days after the incident, Regional Command made their decision. General Rodriguez was relieved of his command and transferred to a desk position pending a full investigation into his conduct. The charges against Maria were dropped, with officials acknowledging that she had acted in legitimate self-defense against an unprovoked attack. When Maria finally returned home, she was greeted by hundreds of supporters who had gathered to celebrate her courage. However, she remained humble about what had occurred, emphasizing that she had simply defended herself and had no desire to be seen as a hero. Her gracious response to the situation only increased the public's respect for her character and integrity. The incident had profound effects that extended far beyond the immediate participants. General Rodriguez's removal from command sent a clear message throughout the military that abuse of authority would not be tolerated, regardless of rank or position. Several other officers who had engaged in similar behavior began to modify their conduct, realizing that they were no longer immune from consequences. Maria returned to her normal life, helping her family run their restaurant, but she was forever changed by the experience. She had learned that the principles her grandfather taught her were not just abstract concepts but practical tools for navigating real-world challenges. The confidence and self-respect she had displayed during the confrontation became permanent aspects of her character. Years later, Maria would become a respected leader in her community, known for her fairness, courage, and willingness to stand up for those who could not defend themselves. She never forgot the lesson that sometimes the most important battles are the ones that choose you, and that true strength comes from having the courage to do what is right even when it is difficult or dangerous. The story of Maria's confrontation with General Rodriguez became legend in the region, inspiring others to stand up against bullying and abuse of power. It demonstrated that courage and dignity could overcome intimidation, and that sometimes one person's refusal to be bullied could create positive change for an entire community. General Rodriguez, for his part, eventually came to understand that his behavior had been wrong and used his remaining military career to become a better leader. The humbling experience taught him important lessons about respect, authority, and the proper treatment of others, regardless of their position or status in society. The young woman who had simply been trying to deliver food to a military base had inadvertently struck a blow for justice and dignity that resonated far beyond that concrete courtyard where she had refused to be knocked down.